Coming and talking to us about open source licenses. And this is an area that I think all of us probably touch in one way or another. But I know it's an area that is a little bit opaque to me and probably to a lot of us. I've looked up things as I needed to, but hopefully a better I'm looking forward to having a better overall view of things. And David's a associate professor at Champlain College, so he teaches computer science, has some books out, and anyway, so with that, David, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to hearing this.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'll share my screen. I do have a presentation to accompany what I'm talking about. Mark is going to kind of monitor the chat he mentioned. So if you have questions as I go through, please don't hesitate, and Mark will kind of jump in and let me know as they work. And we'll also have time at the end to do plenty of discussion. But I'm going to talk to you today about the different kinds of open source licenses, why you need a license on your software, how to appropriately use software that's open source license, and what some of the differences are between the major licenses. But before I get into all of that, I do want to put out a big disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer, I'm a computer science professor. So obviously, you should talk to your in-house counsel, or if you don't have that, external counsel about any serious open source issues. But I do think I'll give you a strong enough overview today that you'll really understand what these licenses are about and what your rights and responsibilities are when you use an open source license. So I want to kind of start with the problem. So this is just a random repository on GitHub, one that people are actually looking at. We can see there's 41 stars on it, a significant number of forks. So people are actually using this random repository that someone developed. I think this was somebody was developing a chess app and they decided to put up their code for other people to be able to build on it, maybe build their own chess apps. Maybe there's even some people developing commercial chess products using some of this open source chess code. You know, you can think about on GitHub, if something has 40 stars, only about like 1% of people that go to a repository actually star it. So you have hundreds, if not thousands of people that are looking at this code, and probably a significant number of people that are actually using this code. But here's the problem. There's no license, right? And we can see that if we actually go to the repository, and you can still see my screen, right, Mark? As I'm as I'm
Yes, looks
outside of
good.
it. Yeah.
Hmm.
If we actually go on the repository, there's no license file listed here. Another place you might look for a license is actually right in the code itself. So if we go into some of the code, there's no license here in any of the code itself. So the two places to look for a license would either be a license file or within the actual source code file, usually in a comment at the top of the file. But there's no license here at all. So then we're dealing with the question of what are my abilities with this repository? Can I use it in my own software? Can I go and reuse this work? I mean, obviously the person put it out there, right? They put it on GitHub. It seems like they want to make it so that other people can use it, right? Unfortunately, the answer is you probably cannot use any of this code. This code is probably off limits, especially if you're doing anything commercial. Without a license that specifically gives the right to you to reuse the code, by default, the original author owns all of the rights to the code and retains full copyright and can actually later on sue you if you went and used this code in your own app. And you might say that doesn't make sense. They obviously had the intention for me to be able to see the code, but intention is not enough. Intention is only part of the battle. So if there's no license, the original creator is retaining all the rights. It's not actually open source software. Open source means more than just I can see the code. I can see the code. Sometimes people use the term source available, meaning you can see the source, but it doesn't mean you can actually do what you want with the source. And if you go and use that code, you may be committing copyright infringement if you don't specifically have the right to use it in some way. So we got to look out for these licenses. Now, I want to take you back to, and you might be surprised where we're going, to the early days of the Republic and the US Constitution. Actually, intellectual property rights were something that the founders of the United States were thinking about. And they included in the Constitution a provision to have some kind of intellectual property rights that were later then expanded upon by laws that Congress passed to specifically create copyright and patents, etc. But even back in 1789, when the Constitution was passed, they were thinking about intellectual property rights. And if you look at the language in the Constitution, what they were looking for a reason to have intellectual property rights was actually for the public good. So the reason we have intellectual property rights is, as it says here, to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So the reason for copyright is not to make the author money, actually. That's a nice byproduct of it. Like, I'm an author, I write programming books. It's nice that nobody else can go and copy my books, and therefore I have a monopoly on the books, and people have to buy them through my publisher, and therefore I have to get royalties for them. That's a nice byproduct of copyright law. But actually, the reason that copyright was originally created was for the public good, to encourage people to write books, to encourage people at that time to come up with new inventions in terms of patent law, so that we would have more books and more inventions in the United States. And as a result of that, how do you incentivize people? Well, what it says here, you give them a limited time monopoly on those works that they've created. By giving them a limited time monopoly, you're encouraging them to create them, because obviously then they can profit off of them and other people can't just copy the works. So that's why we have copyright. And I think that's worth keeping in mind as we have this kind of more in-depth discussion about these licenses. So how does copyright law work with regards to open source software? As soon as you finish writing a work, a written work, whether that be source code, a novel, a poem, whatever it is, you immediately own the copyright. And that's not just true in the United States. That's true in most countries in the world which have signed on to what's called the Berne Convention. So actually, when you finish writing a piece of software, you immediately automatically have the copyright. Now, you can actually go a step further and submit it to the US government to have that officially registered, but you don't actually need to do that to obtain the copyright. You have the copyright immediately when you finish writing the software. Now, there is something that copyright does end, and you can actually decide not to have the copyright to something, and that's called public domain. So standard copyright in the United States is 95 years. So after 95 years, for example, a novel that was written in the 1920s is now becoming public domain, meaning that anybody can do literally whatever they want with it. So I can go and take The Great Gatsby, which is now out of copyright and now in the public domain, and I can go and decide, you know what? I'm going to go and make my own book that I'm going to call The Great Gatsby, and I'm going to like decide that it was written by me and start selling it. You could actually do that. There's nothing illegal about that. You can go and take anything in the public domain and do whatever you want with it. And that extends to software. Now, 95 years is obviously too long for any software to that from just a time period perspective that we would care about to be in the public domain. The first computers come out in the 1940s. The first software companies don't really arrive until the 1960s, 1970s, right? So nothing is just based on a time basis in software automatically in the public domain. But as the author of software, you can decide to put it in the public domain and therefore give other people the right to do absolutely whatever they want with it, no holds barred. They can literally go and do anything with it. Believe it or not, one of the most popular pieces of software in the world has been released into the public domain that is actively developed, and that's SQLite. SQLite is a database engine that is in everything from the Firefox web browser to being included in Windows and in iOS. It's probably the most popular. It is the most popular database engine on in the world, and it is released in the public domain. Yet, believe it or not, the folks behind SQLite, which is a small team, have been able to develop a business around it through support contracts, through customized extensions. So there are actually active businesses that work with software in the public domain, but this is really the exception rather than the rule. What we have mostly is open source licenses. And I have the logos here, and we're going to go through them over the next few minutes. of the most popular open source licenses. So the standard thing to do if you have software that you want to distribute, and I'm going to say quote unquote freely, because we'll talk about in a few minutes what free means, but to other people, the ability to use the code is to give it an open source license. And what you see on the left-hand side of the screen, the MIT license, BSD license, Apache license, those are what are known as permissive licenses, and we'll talk about what that word means. And on the right-hand side, you see here the GPL, LGPL. Those are what are called copyleft licenses, sometimes a little negatively called viral licenses. And we'll talk about what we mean by viral. It is not the same meaning of viral as, let's say, the viral of social media posts going really, really large. It's more viral like the infectious disease type of viral, but there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about it. So there are two different movements that kind of led to open source software. There's the free software movement, which started in the early 1980s and was founded by Richard Stallman. And they are the folks behind the GPL and the LGPL license. And they defined, well, Richard Stallman really did, what free software is. Free software has these four rules that it must follow in order to be considered free. And I'll run through each of them, not in a lot of detail, but in enough I hope that you'll understand it. And these are the four as Richard Stallman defined them. The first is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. So it means if I obtain a copy of the software, I can use it for anything that I want. The second is the freedom to study how the program works. Change it so you do your computing as you wish. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. This is the part that most people just think of. So out of the four of these, it's really number two that most people think of when they think of open source. This is saying, well, I have the ability to see the source code basically and to change the source code. But that's actually not enough for the software to be considered free software. We need actually all four of these. Number three, the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor. What they mean by that is that you can make a copy of the code or a copy of the binary. So if I obtained a copy of the software, it's not just a copy that I have, but it's a copy that I can make a copy of and then give to somebody else. And then number four, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. And the idea here is not only can I give a copy of the original that I received to somebody else, but any changes that I made, I can also give copies of those changes to other people. So if a license follows all four of these freedoms, then it would be considered a free software license. Now, like I mentioned, the free software movement started in the early 1980s. They developed the GPL license by the late 1980s, and it's gone through several revisions. We're up to GPL 3 right now. There was a GPL 1 and a GPL 2. And any license that has these four freedoms, the Free Software Foundation, sometimes abbreviated as the FSF, may go and put a stamp of approval on and say this is an official free software license. Okay, but we're using the term free software. Free software is slightly different than open source software. So open source software has a different definition that has a lot in common, though, with the free software definition. And you might wonder who comes up with these definitions. So in the case of free software, it was originally Richard Stallman, and it's the Free Software Foundation that maintains the idea of what is free software. In the case of open source, there's a separate organization called the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative also goes and puts its stamp of approval on licenses and says this is an official open source license. They have a process for doing that. You can think about it as a certification of a license, kind of in the same way like the American Dental Association certifies toothpastes, right? You have a toothpaste, anyone can make a toothpaste, right? As long as I can pass through the FDA, I can get approval to sell this toothpaste, right? But not every toothpaste actually gets ADA approval, right? So the ADA is a separate organization, the American Dental Association, and they get to decide if they want to put their stamp of approval on a toothpaste and say this toothpaste is ADA approved. Well, it's the same thing in open source licenses. So you have licenses that some people use that they consider open source, but are not open source initiative approved. And then you have most of the popular license, all the popular licenses are open source approved. And there has been some controversies over the years, and I'll mention a couple later on, about licenses that have tried to become open source initiative approved, but have not become approved by the open source initiative. And you might wonder, why does this matter? Well, who goes and defines what open source is, right? And some people even question, should an organization get to define the term? Should it be just a philosophical term? Should it be does this specific organization, should they have the right to make that decision? The way that this happened was in the late 1990s. There were folks who felt that the branding of free software, remember the Free Software Foundation started in the early 1980s, was not doing free software any favors. And so there was kind of a split in the late 1990s at the same time that Linux was really becoming popular. And there were folks who wanted to be a little more pragmatic rather than the more idealistic Free Software Foundation. The more, you might say, ideological. So the Free Software Foundation, you might say, holds more steadfast to the original values of free software. The open source initiative is more willing to kind of work with commercial software producers. And there is that kind of split in the community. So most software actually follows both definitions, and I'll talk about the open source definition in a moment. And so you'll hear a lot of software referred to as free and open source software. But in fact, they are two separate definitions. And here is the kind of summary of the open source definition. Now, remember, with the free software definition, there were only 4 points. With the open source definition, it's a little bit more in depth. And this is really just a summary. You can go check out their description of each of these 10 points on their website. But most of these actually align with the free software definition. So those 4 kind of align with most of these 10. These are a little bit more specific. So it is possible for a license to be a free software license, but not be an open source license. And technically, it's possible for it to go the other way too, for a license to be open source, but not be a free software license. The reality is that the vast majority of licenses are both. And all of the popular licenses, so all the licenses we're going to talk about, both definitions apply to. However, like I said, there have been a couple, and I'll mention a couple examples later on, that have actually not been able to get approval from one or the other. And those are, again, the special cases. But most of the time, you're going to want to be using one of those common licenses anyway. And we'll talk about why in best practices at the end. So I won't go into all to these 10 because there's a lot here, right? And a lot of specifics here. But it's worth it to, if you were getting into our company, especially if you're a large company and you're thinking about, is this going to be approved as an open source licenses? You'd really have to get into the weeds of some of these points. Okay. So let's talk about the 2 big categories of licenses. You've got the permissive licenses on the left here, and you've got the viral licenses on the right here. And I guess I actually should have switched it, right? Because it's copy left. I should have put the copy left ones on the left-hand side. My mistake. But there is a really significant difference between these 2 different categories of licenses. So the copy left licenses, which are also known as the viral licenses, and the most common ones are the GPL, the LGPL. You might have also heard of the Mozilla Public License, the MPL, or maybe you've heard about the Affero General Public License. And I should have mentioned GPL stands for General Public License. And that's a grandiose name, right? Well, when the Free Software Foundation was creating the GPL, it was one of the first of these type of licenses. So they used a really general name, the General Public License. They want it to be able to apply to most kinds of software, therefore being a general license. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So the GPL, the LGPL, and other viral licenses say that if you use the code, you may have to release your code under the same license. That's why they're called viral licenses. Let's just take the GPL. Let's say that chess game that I originally showed you at the beginning, the creator decided to license it under the GPL. If they decided to do that, and then you decided to take that chess game and build a more sophisticated chess game on top of it, your code would also have to be released under the GPL. And therefore, your code would also have to be free and open source software. So if you wanted to go and sell your game, you could totally do that. You could go sell your chess game, but you would have to provide the source code. And so therefore other people would be able to just get the source code and recompile it. It doesn't mean you couldn't sell it. And in fact, there are commercial products that are released under the GPL as well as all of these licenses. But it does mean that other people would have access to the source code and they would be able to build their own versions. So that's the kind of caveat about the copyleft viral licenses. That's why they're sometimes called viral, like infectious, like as if they infect other software that they touch by forcing that other software to also be under the same license. The permissive licenses here, like the MIT license, BSD license, Apache license, they enable you to basically do whatever you want with much fewer restrictions and do not include the restriction that you must release your source code. So they tend to be considered kind of the more corporate friendly licenses because large corporations sometimes don't want to release their source code, of course. And so if they stick to only using permissively licensed open source software, they're not going to get into that situation where they have to release their source code. So thinking across all of these different kinds of licenses, there are two clauses that you will always find, no matter what kind of license it is. One clause is no warranty, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's saying, I don't take any responsibility for what happens when you use this software. So it's basically like we could call it no warranty. Sometimes it's called no liability. I'm not if you use my open source library, let's say you use that chess program and they released it under one of these licenses. The license would say if that chess program eats up your computer or it causes a hard crash or it deletes some of the files on your computer, whatever it does, I'm not taking any responsibility. It's not my problem. I told you that in the license when you got the software. I'm not going to be responsible for anything that goes wrong. And believe it or not, a lot of commercial licenses include this clause as well. So when you actually purchase like, Microsoft Word or something, right? Part of the license also says we're not going to take responsibility if Microsoft Word destroys some of your data. And you might wonder that doesn't sound like very good, right? And they're just protecting themselves legally, right? But all these open source licenses all include this clause. This clause exists in basically every open source license. The other standard clause you'll see in most of the licenses, but not all of them, but it's in the vast majority, is giving credit. So what this means is if you include this open source software in your piece of software, even if your software is proprietary, you somewhere in your software need to acknowledge that it includes that open source software. Now, I'm going to show you this like really explicitly here on my computer. So I'm using Keynote to do this presentation, right? And if I go into the About Keynote screen and I click on Acknowledgements, this opens a PDF file that Apple includes in Keynote that has acknowledgements of all of the open source products that Keynote was built with. They're actually required to do this by the terms of the open source licenses. So this is not just because Apple is being nice and they want to, give credit to all the, open source software that they built Keynote out of. They have to do this. This is a requirement of the licenses saying you must include acknowledgement somewhere. And the way you'll typically see this is in an about box. So just like we're seeing here. If you're building a mobile app, you might sometimes see it in the settings screen. Sometimes in the settings screen, there'll be like a link to click on legal. And then that'll open up, a screen that shows these licenses. If you don't do this, you're technically violating the license. And unfortunately, you'll see it all too often. My background's kind of in the mobile app world. And you'll see it a lot in the mobile app world. You'll see apps that include open source software, and they don't follow through on the license and have an acknowledgement screen. And that is violating the license. Now, in reality, are they likely to get sued, especially if it's some small developer that they're building off of? No, it's pretty unlikely, but it's wrong. I mean, the developer is putting out the software saying, I'm giving you all this free stuff. The only thing I'm asking you is that you acknowledge me and you acknowledge that you're using my stuff. And so if you're not doing that, that's pretty bad, right? That's pretty bad. That's the minimum you could do for all this great free stuff that you got. Okay, here's an example of the full text of one of the licenses. This is the MIT license. This is probably the most popular open source license, depending on what metric you use. Like if you look at number of GitHub repositories under a certain license, you'll get a different number than if you do like a survey of people and see what licenses are they using. But a lot of people would say this is probably the most popular current open source license. It's also perhaps the smallest. One of the BSD licenses, the 2-clause BSD license, is also really short. But in terms of amount of text, this is literally the whole license. And if you look at it, it basically has 3 parts to it. The first part is explicitly saying in that first paragraph that you can do whatever you want with this software. There's no restrictions. It's basically restating the free software definition. It's saying you can copy the software, you can modify it, you can distribute it, you can run it however you want to. It's saying you can do whatever you want. That's what the first paragraph is saying. The middle part here, the above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of the software. That's that acknowledgement clause we were talking about. So it's saying you can do whatever you want with it with only one restriction, and that's that you must acknowledge that you got this software and included it in your own software. So that's the only requirement of the MIT license, which is the most popular open source license. And then the last part here, that's that no warranty clause. That's saying, yeah, I'm giving you this. You got to acknowledge that you got it from me. And then you can't blame me if something goes wrong. If this software doesn't work well, I'm not taking any responsibility. I'm giving it to you for free, and it's your problem now. If anything goes wrong, don't blame me. Don't sue me. You can't. I'm relinquishing myself. I told you up front. I'm not. This doesn't necessarily work for any specific case, and I'm not even saying that it works well. I'm not even saying it's bug free. I'm not even saying that it's not going to do damage. That's on you. You see all the code. It's up to your engineers to go through it and make sure it works correctly. So this is actually the most popular open source license. It is shorter than the other licenses we're going to talk about. And as you see, anyone can read it. Now, if you go online, you can find lawyers that actually have broken down this MIT license line by line. And if you're interested, there's some pretty good articles kind of going through it line by line and explaining what each line means from a legal perspective. But all these major licenses have usually been vetted by legal counsel at some point, which is one of the reasons you might want to use them. Now, there's
Did
another, yeah,
there was a quick question Ian had about, because you mentioned you showed where to find the acknowledgments in a keynote. Also mentioned mobile apps. He was asking about web apps. Where would you find that information in web apps, or are web apps different?
Yeah,
absolutely,
I was
yeah. So
just
often what you'll
thinking.
see on a web app is you'll see something like a legal link on the bottom of the website, like literally at the bottom where you see the privacy policy, where you see the terms of service. And in that legal link, it might be named something else. There'll be just a website, a web page that has all of these acknowledgments of the licenses. And again, you'll see plenty of companies that don't do this, even though they're using open source software and technically they're violating the license. But usually large companies are doing this correctly, and you will see the acknowledgments. So yeah, thanks. That's a
Is
great
there
question.
is there any difference though between with a web app where you're not actually providing the code and you're just running on your server? Does that make it fall under something slightly different?
Yeah, it does. It does differ depending on the license, actually. So, for example, and this can actually play into some of the viral licenses. So the GPL would not actually require if you built a web app that was just on a server and it had no client portion to it, and so people were only accessing it remotely onto the server. The GPL actually does not force you then to release your source code as well, but the AGPL does. And so web service providers that want to be truly open source have been adopting over the last decade the AGPL instead of the GPL. As far as the acknowledgments go, um, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to put that caveat on there. But I do not think that you would then have to necessarily provide the acknowledgments if the software is not something that's being redistributed and it's just being accessed remotely. But it certainly is best practice to do so. So it certainly would be best practice to do so, and I think it's just a a courtesy, really. I mean, the folks who built this open source software, that's the only thing they're asking of you. I mean, it's really the minimum you can do is put the acknowledgement somewhere, right? They're giving it to you for free. They're not, and you might say, so I guess some people might think, well, that's making me like look like I didn't really build my own stuff. I mean, everyone uses open source software. I can't think of a major product today that is like a household name that doesn't have open source software inside of it. So I think it's really the minimum we can do as software developers is put these acknowledgments in. But from a legal perspective, you'd have to ask a lawyer if the software is fully server side and it's not a GPL or one of the licenses that explicitly takes into account server side remote requests, if you have to put the acknowledgement on. But certainly it's best practice to do so. Thanks. That's a great question. Okay, so another license here, the Apache license. It's a lot longer than the MIT license. And all these licenses, even though they're written by lawyers mostly, I think it's certainly possible for anybody to read them and understand what's going on. But I'll just give you kind of a quick summary of how this other popular license is different from the MIT license. The Apache license includes a contributors clause. What the contributors clause says is if you contribute to the original open source project, by default, your contribution will also be under the same license. So, for example, if I have a project on GitHub and somebody gives me a pull request saying, I want to put this patch in, I want to add this part, is that patch under the same license? If it's the MIT license, it's ambiguous. Did your intention mean that you obviously meant it to be under the same license? It's a little unclear. So what a lot of projects will do is they'll have something called a contributor agreement that you'll actually have to sign as a contributor to ensure that you're not going to retain the copyright of this additional portion of software that you're trying to add. The Apache license takes out that ambiguity and it instead says explicitly anything that's contributed will be under the same license unless we decide otherwise, mutually decide otherwise. It also has a patent clause. The patent clause is there to actually protect the original creator of the software, saying, we're putting the software out there, but we're not putting our patents out there that the software might implement. And then there's also a clause here that says you need to state the changes that you make to the software. So if you go and take the Apache licensed software, create a new project, and you modify the original software, you're supposed to state what those modifications are. Now, how you do that, people could debate. So you could say almost that posting on GitHub your changes, because those have you have your different commits and your different commits show the history, that's almost like showing the changes. So people can disagree what it means to state the changes, but it could be that you explicitly have, and this is what you'll see a lot at the top of the source code file, here's how we changed it in the new version, or better than that is to have a separate file called a change log where you say this is what changed in the next version. Okay, we've touched on earlier the GPL. This is the most popular viral license. And again, the big difference here is the idea that any derivatives must be under the same license. So that's the quote infectious nature of it. We're saying that if your software incorporates GPL software, it must also be under the GPL. So the GPL spreads itself. And so you'll see, and we'll talk about this in a minute, companies that will avoid the GPL because they're afraid of accidentally including portions of it in a commercial product that they'll then need to release the source code for. The LGPL is a little bit more moderate than the GPL, and it stands originally for the lesser GPL. Sometimes people refer to it as the L standing for the library GPL. The idea here is that if you modify the original software, you do need to still release your software under the same license. But if you just link against the software, so if you just take the already compiled library and you link against it, the LGPL explicitly says you do not need to buy into that viral clause. So as a commercial software developer, you can link to an LGPL library and not need to release your source code as well. Whereas the GPL is requiring you, if you incorporate the software in any way, to then release your software under the same license. So the LGPL basically makes that exception for just linking against the software. However, with the LGPL, if you do modify the original library, you would still then need to release your modifications of the original library under the LGPL license as well. But if you're just linking against it, which is often what we're doing with libraries, often we just use a library. We don't actually change the original library. Sometimes we do, but we often don't. We can then use it. And the reason the LGPL exists is as a compromise. It was as a way to get virally licensed libraries into broader use, to create more of an ecosystem that uses them to therefore make them more popular and still make progress to what the free software movement would see as the ultimate goal for all software to be free. But it's like an intermediary step. If we get people using LGPL libraries, they'll become standard, and then that might lead to more and more free software. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of companies are afraid of these copyleft licenses, like the GPL and the LGPL. In fact, there's a great case study of this, which is the two most popular compilers in the world. So the two most popular compilers in the world are GCC, which was originally developed by the Free Software Foundation, the GNU project, which is associated with the Free Software Foundation. It's one of the most popular C and C++. It also does Fortran and a bunch of other languages, compilers in the world. And it is licensed under a viral license, of course, right? Because it comes from the Free Software Foundation and the GNU project. Now, Apple was not happy about this because they were using actually, when Apple bought Next in the late 1990s, they had built their infrastructure on GCC. And so Apple was actually using GCC as their main compiler from the time that they bought Next and started developing Mac OS X all the way up to the mid 2000s. And this was always like dangerous because if they wanted to go and include GCC not as a separate binary that developers downloaded, but make modifications to it and let's say include it directly, link it directly into Xcode or something like that, right? Then they would be in danger of maybe needing to apply the GPL license, the viral license to some of their own software, which of course Apple didn't want to do. So Apple actually then invested heavily in what was originally an academic project started by Chris Latner and his professor in graduate school called LLVM, which also includes the C and C++ compiler Clang. The reason they heavily invested beyond maybe some technical merits in that project was because that project was permissively licensed. And so then Apple became one of the main developers and continues to be to this day of LLVM and Clang just because those compilers, that compiler suite is permissively licensed and they didn't want to deal with the viral licenses. So this has also been a compiler that's been adopted by several other companies. NVIDIA has worked on LLVM. Microsoft has worked on LLVM as well. Microsoft has their own proprietary compiler, of course, as well. But it's interesting that some software has almost been funded or exists just because of these licensing issues. So it's a very real thing. And if you look at Apple's use of the GPL licensed software as a whole, since Mac OS X originally came out in 2001, they've been removing more and more GPL licensed software from Mac OS X, and in fact, which is now called just Mac OS again. And in fact, they've explicitly gone and stopped updating old versions of GPL software because they didn't want to have to apply a newer version of the GPL license. So I mentioned there's different versions of the GPL license. The current version is GPL 3. It includes some additional stipulations, closes some loopholes. And Apple never updated any software that was included in Mac OS X from GPL 2 to GPL 3. So they were still using some ancient versions of that open software. And over time, they've been replacing those GPL pieces of software with permissively licensed pieces of software. And perhaps the most notable case is this compiler where they removed GCC and have switched over to Clang/LLVM. So this is a really real thing that that big corporations think about. So we talked about kind of some of the biggest licenses, the MIT, Apache, GPL, LGPL. Here's some other ones you may hear about. BSD 2-clause license and 3-clause license are very, very similar to the MIT license. The AGPL I mentioned briefly earlier, it includes provisions that say server-side software has to also be released the source code has to also be released for server-side software that makes modifications to an original AGPL license. So even if you're keeping something that's only receiving web requests, you're not actually distributing the software to clients, you still have to release it under the viral license. And then the MPL is just another fairly popular viral license that was developed by Mozilla. There are licenses that are not technically open source licenses, but that have a lot in common with open source licenses. Two of these licenses that have been in the news over the last few years are the SSPL, which was adopted by MongoDB. MongoDB was originally under, I believe it was the GPL, but I could be wrong. It might have been the AGPL. But they switched over to the SSPL because Mongo wanted to, and I used to be a Mongo stockholder, so full disclosure, but they wanted to be able to have their own hosting service. So not only are they developing the database, but they're also hosting the database. And there were third-party hosts who were taking MongoDB and they were basically undercutting Mongo on hosting. And so that was not helping Mongo develop their business, right? And so they wanted to kind of cut them off at the knees by switching the license over to stop allowing them to do that with their own modifications, saying that if you take the software and you want to use it for that purpose, you have to release all your modifications, and it was effectively stopping them from doing that. And so Mongo did this for business purposes, basically, right? But there was a lot of controversy when they did this because the SSPL, they tried to get approved by the open source initiative, and it was not approved by the open source initiative. It didn't match, and I forgot which ones, but a couple of their 10 clause definition of open source software, according to them, according to the open source initiative. So the open source initiative refused to put their stamp of approval on the SSPL. So by definition, then, MongoDB is no longer open source according to the open source initiative. Now, some people might debate, again, whether the open source initiative should be able to be the arbiter of what is open source. But I would agree with their decision. And I haven't looked at this case in a couple years, but when I looked at it originally, I kind of agreed, like the license doesn't completely match the open source definition, but other people have their own opinions on it. Another one, this was has to do with something really current with LLMs. So Meta, you might be familiar with their Llama series of LLMs. They released Llama 2, which was the first one that really made a big splash, under a license that said if you have a certain number of users, you can't use the software. Now you might wonder why. That sounds like a very specific reason to stop somebody from being able to use the software. It was to stop the other large tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, etc., from being able to use their LLM inside their products. So this explicitly goes against both the free software definition and the open source definition, because the free software definition and the open source definition both say anybody can use this software for any purpose. In fact, the open source definition, one of the 10 clauses, is explicitly you cannot discriminate. So you can't discriminate based on the standard things that we don't want people to discriminate on, but you can't discriminate on anything, the open source definition says. And that would include discriminating against certain companies, saying that large companies can't use this. That is explicitly against the open source definition. So even though it was hailed when they released Llama 2, oh, it's the first like open LLM, it is not actually fully open. And this was picked up by some of the press, but it should have been probably more of a story. Okay. Remember we talked about the Apache license having that contributor clause, saying that if you contribute to an Apache project, your project also needs to be, your contribution is also under the Apache license by default. An even better thing to do and a safer thing to do if you're a serious big open source project is to have a contributor license agreement. And this is where you have somebody explicitly sign before you accept their contribution that they're going to provide their contribution to the original project under an open license. And in fact, some of these contributor agreements will say they actually are handing over the copyright to the original authors. Now, why do you want to do that? Well, what if later on the project decides we're going to change the license? Okay, if the original project is going to change the license and they don't actually hold the copyright to all the different pieces of the project, They can't do that. And there have been some nightmares where this has happened. They want to change a license. They have to go find everybody who ever contributed to the project and get them to sign a legal document. You don't want to do that. So if your project is super serious, it's got a lot of contributors, you probably want to have a contributor license agreement, especially if you're not using the Apache license. If you're using the Apache license, it already includes that contributors clause. But if you're using another license, it's a good idea to have some kind of contributor license agreement if you're building something serious. Okay. What if you are a software developer? What are the best practices in relation to everything we've talked about? The first thing is you should probably choose a standard license. Here's one of my own open source projects. It's called SwiftGraph. It's actually a relatively popular project. I licensed it originally under the Apache license. The Apache license gives me those protections like the contributor clause that ensure that, I'm not going to have problems later on. Where should you put that you're under the Apache license or any of these licenses? You should put a license file in the original project, and you should also often put the license, at least an acknowledgement of it. It doesn't have to be the full license. The Apache license, for example, even gives you a sample of what that snippet should look like in the original source files. So you should actually, at the top of all your source files, every single source file in your open source project, you should have, this is the license it's under. If it's the MIT license, it's so short, you can put the whole license there. If it's the Apache license, usually you put this little snippet there, and then you're going to have the license file as a separate file in your repository. And then if you're not using the Apache license, if you're using something that doesn't have a contributors clause, you should probably have a contributors agreement, especially if your project is gaining some real momentum and steam and starting to have a significant number of contributors. So these are standard kind of best practices for your open source project. What if you're on the other side? What if you're just building an app and you're just using open source libraries? Well, we saw earlier on the keynote example, right? You should have an acknowledgement section somewhere in your app that says, here's the open source components that we're including. If your app is client side, so if it's something, a mobile app, a desktop app, you're actually required to do that by the licenses. You must do that. It would be best practices to do, though, on any kind of software. Also, make sure that you're checking that that you're in compliance with all the other clauses. So don't just assume that every license is the same. As we saw today, there's significant differences even between the popular licenses, right? So you need to actually be aware of the individual licenses of the different pieces that you're including. Acknowledgements is just the minimum, right? If you're using GPL or LGPL software, you might need to be releasing your source code, right? If you are using the Apache license, you might need to be aware of how this relates to some patents, right? So ideally, if you're a commercial company, you should have a lawyer that's doing what's called open source compliance and double checking that you're using these appropriately. If you're a smaller company, then you should at least understand the differences between these licenses and what your rights and responsibilities are related to them. Okay, how do we do on time, Mark? We got 10 minutes left, a
Oh,
little
that's great.
longer.
And
Yeah.
we got a few questions in here, so let me get through the questions.
Okay.
First of all, thanks. This is great. And somebody did ask if the PDF of the talk was going to be available. They wanted, so if there's a way we can get that, I can
I can
email.
absolutely do that. I'll send that over to you, Mark, and then you can
Perfect.
distribute it. Yeah.
Okay, Ian was asking about, let's see, he had a good question here. Oh, in the world of AI, where coding agents are trained on open source code, are there concerns about code I generate and how I use that?
Absolutely. And that's an active area of kind of legal discussion. And I think we're seeing what will likely be the first challenges over there already has been one significant one. I forgot the details of it, but this is working its way through the court system right now, actually. And what you're seeing with LLMs is sometimes they're generating code that is almost completely identical to an open source repository that they were trained on. And I think that's really where this is so explicit and such a danger, right? Is so if your LLM, let's say you're doing something very esoteric, like you're building an app for pizza ovens, okay? And somebody has released an open source library for pizza ovens, and the LLM was trained on that library. And because that's one of the only things it was trained on related to pizza ovens, it's literally almost verbatim copying the original source code in source code it's generating for you.
Mm.
To me, that seems like copyright infringement if you're not following the original license. That's my personal opinion. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is working its way through the courts right now. And I think that the main question is it a transformative use of the original code? So is it being transformed into something new, or is it just the original code being spat out again? And if it is just the original code being spat out again, I think there are some issues there. I've seen some. I saw this a few months ago on Hacker News, a product that was checking if LLM generated code, the similarity score of it related to open source licenses that open source software, excuse me, that is on GitHub. So it was like just automatically doing checks to see like a similarity score. I think that's going to be more common going forward, but this is an active area in the courts right now.
So it sounds like what you're describing as being different is if if it's spitting out the same thing because it saw that and that's the only thing it's seen that looks like that versus if it's seen a bunch of different things and maybe comes up with something that accomplishes the same thing, but it's based on hundreds of different ways people have approached that particular problem. That's what you're seeing as being transformative versus I just spat out the code I saw.
Yeah, I think what is the difference
Okay.
between what the LLM created and the original code that it was trained on?
Okay.
If it's truly a new application where the code is has a large difference, that might be considered transformative. Whereas if it's literally verbatim giving us the original version, we're gonna run into some issues there. And actually, this is the same discussion that's going on right now with AI art, right? So how transformative is an image generated versus the original image? Is it
Right.
really like is it really something new, or is it, and what are the rights of the original creator of the art in terms of, let's say, style? So let's say the image is actually of something different, but it follows the same style. These are the interesting kind of cases that are working their way through right now.
So next question, Jay asked, he said, just to confirm something I think I heard earlier. If we incorporate software under a viral license for a company's internal use, or internal use only, not distributed external to the company, would we not be required by the license to release any enhancement or updates to the licensed software itself?
Yes, that's correct. So if and that's correct for the GPL as well as the LGPL. For the AGPL, if you had an internal intranet that people were connecting to, but not the public, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to answer that. But that's definitely correct for the GPL and the LGPL. So for the GPL and the LGPL, if your app is fully internal and is not being distributed, then you can certainly use GPL software as a basis for it. But keep in mind, sometimes people build internal apps that they later on want to distribute. They realize we built something so great, we want to sell it later on, right? As
Uh-huh.
soon as you then want to use that software outside of your organization, you're going to be beholden to the GPL.
Okay. And the Affero license tries to add on to that with the idea that if you're not giving the people the software but you're selling access to it, then there's stipulations that the GPL and LGPL don't have. Is that kind of the difference there?
That's yeah, that's
Okay.
exactly right. Yep.
Okay. Let's see. And then Ian also asked, as a developer pulling in libraries with a mix of licenses, can we get into a situation where there's some toxic combination? What might those be?
Yeah, there are licenses that are incompatible with each other. So for example, let's say you were mostly including GPL software, right? And then you also were going to use, um, let's say, the MongoDB license under the SSPL, right? The GPL and the SSPL do not, their clauses clash with each other. And so you could actually lead to a situation where you literally can't release that software because, and this was assuming you wanted it to be open source in the first place because you're using GPL, right? But you could not use those two combinations together and it still be a legally cohesive whole. So there
Okay.
are licenses that are incompatible with each other. And in fact, the Free Software Foundation publishes a list of of GPL compatible licenses. So
Okay.
GPL is usually the one that people are the most worried about, and you can check out their list to be sure.
Now, Lopo just brought up a scenario. So, with the idea that you're just using this internally, he said, so if an employee wants to share a GPL based software, they can. What
Um, not well,
how
not exact. I don't. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't 100% agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Because the person who created the modified software based on the GPL now owns the copyright to that software. So
okay,
if the it depends what the agreement is between the employee and the corporation. So was the employee somebody who worked on the software, and were they assigned IP rights because they didn't, maybe they had IP rights somehow, or was it that the IP rights are owned by the corporation? So they would, it's still they still have that copyright. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it depends on the specifics of who owns the intellectual property.
okay. So there may be some other aspects other than they may not get in trouble from a licensing standpoint, but they could have still got in trouble from
Right,
intellectual
exactly.
property theft or something like that.
Right. They might
Okay,
have a right by the GPL to distribute it, but they might not have, they might actually be the owner of the copyright. The corporation might be the owner of the copyright, and
okay,
they might not want their modifications to be distributed.
okay. That's an interesting question, Lopo. That was very interesting. Any other questions for David? And I'll tell you what, I will stop the streaming here just in case somebody wants to ask questions but doesn't want